Alright, welcome back everyone to the channel Millennial Messiah, and we are continuing on reading from the book The Lords of Easy Money, How the Federal Reserve Broke the American Economy, and we will continue on with Chapter 7 called Quantitative Quagmire. 2012 to 2014. When Jerome Powell joined the Fed Board of Governors, he joined one of the strangest, most isolated workplaces on earth. The Fed governors worked out of well appointed offices that lined in a long hallway in the Eccles building. Near the cavernous, ornate boardroom, though they work on the same floor of the same building, the governors didn't simply pop into one another's offices to ask for advice or even share a thought. Decisions were set up by appointment through the governor's assistants. One of Powell's neighbors was a governor, was Elizabeth Betsy Duke, one a former bank executive and chairwoman of the American Bankers Association. Duke said she was struck by just how isolating it was to be a Fed governor. "It was the loneliest job I ever had," she recalled. The social atmosphere was a strained one. But Jerome Powell managed to fit into it smoothly. This was one of his primary skills in life. Powell was charming, smart, and even humble in his way, with a self-effacing humor that was impossible to fake. Everyone called him Jay. He had spent his career inside the corridors of American power, moving back and forth between the institutions of big government and big money. When Jay Powell was around the most important and powerful people in the world, he knew what to say and how to say it. He grew up in the wealthy suburbs of Washington, D.C., attended Georgetown Law, and then went to work on Wall Street in the investment world. After that, he had a senior position in the U.S. Treasury Department under the first president, President George Bush. And then, when he jumped to a very powerful private equity firm called the Carlyle Group. Carlyle was so rich and run by a group of Washington insiders who were so powerful that it spawned a number of conspiracy theories that were surpassed only by the Federal Reserve. After his time at Carlyle, Powell was a very wealthy and joined a think tank in Washington. He was nominated to be a Fed governor by Barack Obama as part of a compromise deal. Obama nominated one liberal, a Harvard professor named Jeremy Stein, and one conservative who was Jay Powell. Powell arrived at the Fed in May 2012, just as the FOMC was entering a period of tense debate. Ben Bernanke was pushing for a new, much larger round of quantitative easing, but he was facing an unprecedented amount of dissent within the committee. Debates inside the FOMC that summer revealed the remarkable level of skepticism and outright opposition to Bernanke's plan. During the meeting in late July, about half of the voting FOMC meeting members expressed concerns about quantitative easing. Bernanke began to push hard against this opposition because economic growth remained weak and the unemployment rate remained high, almost 4 years after the crash of 2008. This long period of anemic growth was entirely expected and predictable because the big debt overhang that remained from the housing bubble. But Bernanke felt pressure to act and to keep the Federal Reserve at the center of efforts to boost the American economy. To achieve this, Bernanke pushed the Fed to use tools that were once considered experimental, even radical, but were now the only tools at the Fed's disposal. The Fed had already employed two of its most powerful tools by this time Powell arrived. The first was forward guidance, whereby the Fed guaranteed that it would keep interest rates low, encouraging more lending and speculation. In January, the Fed had signaled it would keep interest rates at zero for another 3 more years, an extraordinary escalation of the guidance. The second tool was Operation Twist, a bond buying program similar to quantitative easing, but with one more important difference. Operation Twist didn't pump more cash into the banking system, but only sought to encourage more lending by pushing down the interest rates on long term treasury bills. The Fed had launched a new Operation Twist operation in late 2011 and extended it to 2012. But as summer rolled around, Bernanke needed something more. He had turned to the final, most powerful, and most controversial tool, quantitative easing. Bernanke began to push for a larger, longer lasting round of quantitative easing, arguing that this may be a new round would accomplish what the previous round had not. Quantitative easing had now become a normal tool of monetary policy and had even earned its own shorthand description at the Fed and on Wall Street, where people referred to it simply as QE. But even as it was normalized, internal dissent against QE was growing inside the FOMIC. Bernanke faced resistance from Fed governors and multiple regional bank presidents. This growing dispute put pressure on Jay Powell to figure out where he stood and to figure it out quickly. A series of FOMIC votes in July, August, and September would determine the future course of the Fed and the financial system. The way this worked is that the Fed bought long term Treasury bills and then simultaneously sold an equal amount of short term Treasuries into the market. This maneuver was the twist. The Fed was taking long term bills out of the market, which lowered the interest rate for those bills by increasing demand for them. But the fact that it was selling an equal value or short term bills ensured that it wasn't increasing the total supply of new cash in the banking system. Every dollar the Fed added through a long term T bill purchase, it took away with a short term T bill sale. The goal was to dissuade investors from saving money in a 10-year Treasury bill while not flooding the banking system with cash. Powell began to work closely with Betsy Duke, a vocal critic of quantitative easing. Both Powell and Duke had come to the Fed from the world of private banking and finance, so they shared a certain sensibility and technical understanding about the way the Fed influenced the real world of hedge funds and banks. It seemed to be this knowledge that made them skeptical about another round of QE. Duke expressed her concerns and repeatedly and forcefully during several FOMIC meetings. She was worried that QE would just build up more risk in the financial system without doing all that much to help the real economy. She was also worried that the Fed didn't seem to have an exit plan. Quantitative easing was easy to execute but difficult to reverse, and reversing QE became more difficult the larger the program became. Duke's concerns were amplified by two regional bank presidents, Richard Fisher from Dallas and Jeffrey Lacker from Richmond. Fisher thought QE encouraged risk speculations and asset bubbles. Lacker feared that more QE would make it harder for the Fed to ever raise interest rates again. Jay Powell had an outsized influence in this debate because he was a governor. Bernanke focused his energy on lobbying the governors to get behind his plan in a way that felt safely neutralized. That way, any objections that might come from cantankerous regional bank presidents. That was the way that the Bernanke Fed worked, Betsy Duke recalled. You didn't have dissent from any of the governors. Bernanke viewed it as a particularly big deal. He said he didn't want dissents. When Bernanke lobbied the Fed governors, the lobbying was aimed at a particular goal. The goal was to build unanimous support among the governors for something called Option B. When the FOMIC members gathered for their official meeting, they generally consider three policy options for voting on. The option labels are labeled A, B, and C and arranged like Goldilocks porridge, ranging from hottest to coldest in their effect on the money supply. Option A was usually the most aggressive, a round of QE that would be worth 1.5 trillion, while option C would be extremely conservative, like doing no QE at all. Option B was always structured to be just right. Bernanke spent his time between meetings formulating an option B that satisfied the governors and guaranteed their votes when the meeting came around. The objective, always, for the meeting is to come out with option B, Duke said. Bernanke was willing to accept one dissenting vote from a regional bank president, but not much more than that. In his very first meeting at the FOMIC, Powell was diplomatic and warm. He voted for option B, but Powell also signaled that his thinking would hew more closely to Betsy Duke's than to Ben Bernanke's. Powell opened his remarks with something that would become a habit of his. He talked about what his friends and contacts were saying in the private sector. He often surveyed his contacts with precision and rigor. In one meeting, he broke down their responses by percentage, like a Gallup opinion poll. During his first meeting in May, Powell said that QE should be reserved as a backup tool, something to be used as a defense weapon going forward. He indicated that the weapon was probably not needed now. His industry contacts said that growth was slow, but he wasn't convinced the slowdown would last into 2013. This critique was hardly as sharp as the others that were expressed against QE during the meetings, but it signaled that Powell's support could not be taken for granted. Bernanke lobbied the governors between meetings, an easy job because their offices were a short walk down the hallway from his own. He lobbied them as a politician might do, building support for his cause and seeking to isolate opponents who might hinder it. The FOMIC discussions were open and transcribed for history, but Bernanke's private meetings were not. This allowed people to speak freely. Betsy Duke very much enjoyed these meetings, even when she disagreed with Bernanke. He was a great listener. When Bernanke tried to persuade the Fed governors, He did so respectfully and intelligently. He presented them studies, and he read the studies that they provided in response. He called them unexpectedly. He traded emails and debated. The process wasn't necessarily contentious. Duke, for one, enjoyed the back and forth. Duke and her colleagues were not an easy sell on QE. Everyone seemed to agree that you had declining benefits, she recalled, and those tiny benefits came with larger risks down the road. The concerns were, how do you exit? How do you stop? One of Bernanke's secret weapons in the lobbying effort was his chairman woman, Janet Yellen, the former president of the San Francisco Fed. Yellen was an assertive and convincing surrogate for Bernanke, and she championed an expansive use of the Fed's power. Betsy Duke had become close with Janet Yellen early on. They talked over a private dinner and commiserated about the strange isolation and stress of being a Fed governor. Yellen joked that she could have keeled over dead in her office at the Eccles building, and no one would have found her body for days. Yellen was friendly, even jovial, when she expressed her views, but she was not in any way ambiguous. Janet was the strongest advocate for unlimited quantitative easing, Duke recalled. Janet would be very forceful. She is very confident, very strong in promoting the point of view. Yellen and Bernanke were convincing, and their argument rested on a simple point. In the face of uncertainty, the Fed had to err on the side of action. Bernanke pushed this view to Duke, along with others over wavering FOMIC members like regional bank presidents Sandra Piantialo of Cleveland and Dennis Lockhart of Atlanta and Narayana Charloka of Minneapolis. All of this lobbying meant that the key policy decision making was essentially finished by the time the regional bank presidents traveled to Washington to vote. The regional presidents seemed to sense this fact, and they tailored their criticisms to affect future votes, or give cover to the Fed governors who might want to break ranks. Richard Fisher, the Dallas president of the Fed, had grown adept at this art. During the FOMIC meeting in late July, he gave a long, impassioned speech against Bernanke's push into deeper and deeper interventions. Fisher didn't just argue on the philosophical merits of the Fed's ZERP policies, he presented a specific, detailed case study illustrating how the policies were already causing dangerous distortions in the economy. Fisher said that he had recently spoken with the chief financial officer of Texas Instruments, who explained how the company was managing money in the age of ZERP. The company had just borrowed $1.5 billion in cheap debt, but it didn't plan to use the cash to build a factory, invest in research, or even hire workers. Instead, the company used the money to buy back shares of its own stock. This made sense because the stock paid a dividend of 2.5%, while the debt only costs between 0.45% and 1.6% to borrow. It was a finely played maneuver of financial engineering that increased the company's debt, drove up its stock price, and gave a handsome reward to shareholders. Fisher drove home the same point by relating his conversation with the CFO. He said, and I gave his permission to quote, I'm going, I am not going to use it to create a single job, Fisher reported. And I think this is the issue. We work under the assumption that lowering the cost of capital and providing cheap money encourages businesses to level up and to use what levering up to expand capital investment and job creation, which is part of our mandate. I don't believe that's happening. Fisher was describing specifically how ZERP was already building up systemic risks in the economy without creating a single job. Bernanke rarely responded directly to such statements, but in this case he made the exception. Thank you, Bernanke said. President Fisher, I know we put on a lot of value on anecdotal reports around this table, and often to a great credit, but I do want to urge you not to overweight the microeconomics options of private sector people who are not trained in economics. With this comment, Bernanke seemed to have inflicted upon Fisher the most humiliating wound possible in the culture of the FOMIC. He had exposed Richard Fisher as being unsophisticated. Neither Fisher nor, presumably, the CFO of Texas Instruments had earned a PhD in economics. This put them at a supposed disadvantage when it came to comprehending the effects of programs like quantitative easing. The Fed's leadership sometimes acted as if only the army of trained economists at the Fed, up to and including its chairman, could understand the designs and the effects of the Fed's actions. The implied superiority of economists was a real, very real force at the Fed, on display at every FOMIC meeting. When PhD trained staff gave long and minutely detailed presentations about the policy choices at hand, the Fed historian Peter Conti Brown showed how this dynamic helped consolidate power into the hands of trained economists at the Fed like Bernanke and his staff. Without a PhD in economics, according to one former governor, the Fed staff will run technical rings around you, Conti Brown wrote in his 2007 book, The Power and Interdependence of the Federal Reserve. This power was also directed against critics like Powell and Duke, who came from the world of banking rather than academia. During the July meeting, Jay Powell took a measured approach. He bluntly acknowledged that EQ would stoke economic growth primarily by first stoking asset prices. I suspect that the channels that we're using now, which principally are asset prices, may not be working at all as well as our models say, Powell said. QE was building up risks in the economy, he continued, but the risks were probably manageable. Still, he didn't think another round of QE was necessary. And for me, I think that the bar for another large LSAP is high and not yet met, he said. Using an alternative acronym for QE, LSAP stands for Large Scale Asset Purchase, and people at the Fed use it interchangeably with QE. Bernanke did believe the bar had been met. but by late July, he still could not push the FOMIC to agree with him. The option B, approved at the meeting, was a lukewarm statement that didn't commit to another round of QE. Bernanke had the chance to change this in late August when he invited and was invited to speak at the prestigious Black Hole Jackson County retreat. He had used that venue to build support for quantitative easing in 2010, and now he would do it again. The weather was beautiful as the elite economists and central bankers arrived at Jackson Hole, and Bernanke's speech was seen as the main event. But Bernanke had cause to feel Fed gloomy. The attendees were hardly more friendly to Bernanke's plan for more EQ than were the members of the FOMIC. Even at Jackson Hole, there was deep dispute about what the Fed was doing. Some economists argued that QE wasn't even achieving its primary goal of lowering long term interest rates. Others argued that it had done that, but wasn't creating any meaningful gains for the economy. The dour looking and influential Harvard economist Martin Fieldstein wrote and spent a lot of his time at Jackson Hole walking around and bad mouthing Bernanke's policies to any media outlet that would listen. The networks were eager to hear Fedstein's reviews because he was an advisor to the Republican presidential candidate Mitt Romney. In an interview with Fox Business, Fedstein said that the U.S. economy was in a deep hole, but pointed out that low interest rates and cheap lending could do nothing to fix the real problems that afflicted the country. I don't think there's much the Fed can do, Fedstein wrote and said in a quote to the Wall Street Journal that was even more direct. The Fed is at a point where another round of quantitative easing would be a mistake. Bernanke's speech that year was presented as an assessment of the Fed's actions since 2008. It carried a neutral title, Monetary Policy Since the Onset of the Crisis. Bernanke purported to weigh the benefit and the cost of policies like quantitative easing, forward guidance, and Operation Twist. He seemed to be very careful not to use the common English or talk about what the Fed was doing in a way that might accidentally be understood by anyone without advanced degrees in economics. To give just a flavor, when Bernanke described the way that QE affected markets, he said, one mechanism through which such purchases are believed to affect the economy is the so called portfolio balance channel. The key premise underlying this channel is that for a variety of reasons, different classes of financial assets are not perfect substitutes in investors' portfolios. Bernanke's very dense speech outlined the potential benefits and potential drawbacks of QE. This approach helped his campaign to build more support for QE precisely because the benefits and costs were hard to measure. One economist's asset bubble was another's healthy market. His speech meandered through this ambiguous terrain until Bernanke uttered one more line that would truly move markets. Overall, however, a balanced reading of the evidence supports the conclusion that central bank security purchases have provided meaningful support to the economic recovery while mitigating deflationary risks, he said. This was the statement that would be carried at the top of the Wall Street Journal's story on Jackson Hole. Bernanke was saying that QE worked. He was also saying that the Fed would not rule out the further use of such policies. It was clear to signal to Wall Street that the traders ought to hitch up their horses and get ready to ride. Bernanke's speech overrode the deep divisions on display inside the FOMC by fueling the so-called announcement effect. This happens when the very hint of a new action from the Fed changes what investors expect, which is then makes the market's prices start to change. Bernanke had benefited from this effect in 2010 when he fed the expectation that another round of QE was on the way, causing some stock and bond prices to rise. This meant that not initiating another round of QE would cause prices to fall, putting a very heavy burden on any FOMC member who might vote no. If Bernanke was slowly squeezing his own FOMC into a narrow set of choices, he justified what he was doing by pointing to two very large economic threats, one foreign and one domestic, that he believed justified his plans. The, the foreign threat came from Europe. The domestic threat came from Congress. In Europe, the financial crisis of 2008 had never really ended. The debt overhanging in Europe was simply astounding. Just 3 European banks had taken on so much debt before 2008 that their balance sheets mounted up to 17% of the entire world's GDP. Europe was crippled for many years. European banks and governments owed their debt in dollars, so the European Central Bank couldn't just create more dollars to bail them out as the Fed had done in the United States. The Fed had been working hard to stop the bleeding, extending the swamp lines that flooded Europe with dollars. But there was only so much the swamp lines could do. By 2012, Europe was at a risk of entering a doom loop, whereby failed governments' loans would damage the banks, which in turn would suffer huge losses and drag down growth, making it harder for the governments to stay or pay off further debt. As always, this threatened the United States because a massive European downturn would hurt demand for U.S. goods. The second threat, the domestic threat, was even more urgent. The Tea Party movement had effectively neutralized Congress. The only acceptable public policy plan, in the eyes of the Tea Party leaders, was to cut taxes, cut government spending, and reduce government regulation. Side note, I agree with those. Cutting taxes, cutting government spending, and reduce government regulation. I think, personally, this is just now my own opinion, that that's the way it should be. Continuing on. In the summer of 2011, the Tea Party pushed its crusade into new terrain, threatening to default on the federal government's debt if the Obama administration and the Democratic controlled Senate did not adopt Tea Party policies. This fight was centered on what was once a routine vote to pay the government's bills, a vote known as raising the debt ceiling. This term was misleading. The vote wasn't to increase overall spending and debt, but just to finance the spending to which the government was already committed. This nuance was meaningless to the Tea Party, which would not vote to pay. Standard and Poor's downgraded U.S. government debt, an asset that was once considered a riskless bet. A debt default loomed for the first time in American history. This catastrophe was only averted when the White House and the Tea Party reached a very strange compromise. Congress agreed to pay its bills, but only if a time bomb was installed in the federal budget. The time bomb was a series of automatic spending cuts that were so draconian and irresponsible that even many Republicans couldn't live with them. The theory was that the insanity of these cuts would force Congress and the White House to agree to new, better compromise before the date of detonation. This date, as it happens, was set for January 1st, 2013. Bernanke called the looming budget cuts, which totaled about 500 billion, the fiscal cliff. The cuts amounted to about 3 or 4% of all economic growth in the United States. Economists feared such cuts would push the country immediately into recession. In the face of these dangers, Bernanke believed that the Fed needed to have the courage to act, and he was helping ensure that the FOMC had no choice but to act. In the days after the Jackson Hole speech, public perceptions began to harden that more QE was coming, and the Wall Street traders began to focus their attention on the Fed's next meeting in September, when they expected this QE to be announced. Before that happened, the measure would need to be passed by the FOMC, preferably with no more than one dissent. Bernanke had used dense economic language to promote QE publicly. Now his team would use the same approach internally with the FOMC. The Fed's economists were already working on a presentation steeped in numbers and full of charts to present at the next meeting. The presentation told a story about QE that was very hopeful and almost entirely wrong. On September 12th, the members of the FOMC gathered in Washington, D.C. for their regular policy meeting. Bernanke had prepared the ground for another round of quantitative easing, but the scope and shape of the new program were still unclear. Bernanke and Yellen were pushing for an open-ended program. Early versions of the much polished Option B called for QE plan that had no set end date. The open-ended nature of the plan was meant to be a compromise with those who objected to it. The idea was that the Fed could readjust or even end the program if it proved to be unnecessary. There was a sense of inevitability inside the room. Bernanke's speech at Jackson Hole had built up such high expectations on Wall Street that a new round of quantitative easing would be announced the following day. But it wasn't enough for the FOMC to vote based on a sense of inevitability. The entire rationale for having the committee was that its members would vote on policies after a dispassionate debate. The meeting opened with a long presentation from two Fed staff economists that seemed designed to settle any doubts about the new round. The study was framed as a scientifically rigorous forecast of what another round of quantitative easing might do and how long it would last. It used rigorous academic language and was full of a precise measurements and graphs. But this presentation, for all its detail, was catastrophically wrong. in virtually every important prediction that it made, revealing the grave mistakes all pointed in the same direction. And it was a direction that would help Bernanke push his case. The presentation was written by Seth Carpenter and Michelle Easer. Carpenter presented their findings to the FOMIC. He was a relatively young economist, but his PhD from Princeton and years of working on a Fed researcher gave him a firm command of complex issues. His demeanor, his vocabulary, exuded expertise and cool competence. The dragon he employed was almost numbingly intimidating, as when he pointed out at the beginning of his presentation that the staff analysis starts from a term structured model that embeds treasury and MBS supply factors as determinants of the yield curve. In spite of the jargon, the main points were simple enough. The forecast predicted that short term interest rates would remain pinned at 0% throughout 2013 and 2014. As the new round of QE was rolled out, but after that, the forecast predicted that the rates would start to climb again, rising until they reached historically normal levels around the year 2017. Things would get fully back to normal about 2018, when short term interest rates would return to roughly 4.5% or higher. This was magical thinking. In reality, the Fed funds rate stayed at 0.04% until the end of 2016. By the middle of 2018, the rate had only risen to less than 2%, or half the rate that was forecast. This same pattern of error held true for other key metrics, like the average rate on a 30-year home loan. This was forecast to drop at first, but then rise steadily until 2020, when the rates would be above 6%. In reality, home loan rates rose during 2013, but then stalled out and fell steadily until 2015, when they hit 3.6%. The rate never hit the 6% that was forecast and was only 3.5% by early 2020. The gravest errors had to do with the Fed's balance sheet, which reflected just how many bonds the Fed would buy, and conversely, how many new dollars it would inject into the financial system. Carpenter and Easer focused on the value of the account used by the Fed traders in New York. The Fed predicted that its holdings would expand quickly during 2013 and then level off at around 3.5 trillion after the Fed was done buying bonds. After that, the balance sheet would start to shrink gradually as the Fed sold off all the assets it bought, falling to under 2 trillion by 2019. In reality, the value of assets in the Fed's account exploded far faster and far more than the Fed expected, hitting 4.2 trillion by 2016. The amount remained at that high level virtually unchanged until February 2018. In other words, the Soma account became twice as large as the Fed expected it to, and it never shrank in the way the Fed had forecast. There was a final important error in Carpenter's presentation. It assumed that the rate of price inflation would fall during 2012 and then start to rise again, continuing to rise steadily throughout 2015. At that point, it would level off and hover around 2%, which happened to be the level the Fed was targeting with its policies. This never happened. The inflation rate lagged below the Fed target rate of 2% for almost the period of 2012 and 2020. The rate was still 1.9% by December 2019. This last error carried profound consequences. The rate of price inflation was basically the only external brake that could be applied to the ZERP policies. If consumer prices started to rise, then external pressure would be built and build for the Fed to raise interest rates and undo quantitative easing. But if that didn't happen, the Fed would keep interest rates at zero and keep buying bonds. Even as Carpenter walked through his presentation, he peppered his commentary with caveats and warnings. He tried to explain that the forecast was just merely an educated guess. The forecast was based on theoretical models, and those models were based on certain assumptions about the way the world worked. But there is layering a model upon model to try to get these effects, he said after the presentation. When asked about the presentation years later, Seth Carpenter was almost sheepish about it. Well, I certainly get mocked for it, he said with a laugh. The reasons for the Fed's errors were systemic, and they illuminated how much the Fed used its unrivaled research capacity. When trying to figure out the future, Carpenter relied on a macroeconomic model called the FRB/US model. That model assumed that economic conditions would, over time, revert to the historically normal state. Interest rates, inflation, and unemployment rate would all tend to go back to the levels where they had been over the previous decade. The shortcoming of most macro models is that the vast majority of them make the assumption that over time conditions will revert to a prevailing norm, Carpenter said. When taken together, the mistakes made it seem as if a new round of QE would be an emergency action that would quickly boost growth and create jobs, and which would then be repealed so everything could return to normal. If that was true, then quantitative easing would be a tool like others used by the Fed, like interest rate cuts that could be turned out to the opposite, uh, that could be imposed and then quickly withdrawn as conditions changed. The truth turned out to be the opposite. The distortions from quantitative easing were deep and long lasting, and the program once employed was essentially never ending. These forecasting errors were not an isolated incident. Central banks around the world consistently misled themselves about the effects of quantitative easing. The banks overestimated EQ's positive impact overall on their economic output. When compared against studies conducted by outside researchers, according to a 2020 study by the National Bureau of Economic Research, and central bank researchers who reported larger effects from quantitative easing tended to advance faster in their careers, the study found. This could have been due to the fact that the researchers reported to the very central bank leaders who were pushing for the programs. The forecasts helped Bernanke make the argument that the FOMC was only making a limited and flexible commitment. But other committee members were still strikingly critical of the plan. Dennis Lockhart, president of the Atlantic Fed, was clearly torn about it. I have I have some reservations about going down the path of new QE, he said. This time around, it seems to me that we face a more controversial, conventional problem of inadequate demand, and I'm not convinced that lowering general market rates will stimulate much credit expansion and spending. Sandra Piantialo, president of the Cleveland Fed, said that another round of quantitative easing would not help as much as the earlier rounds, and that it would be hard to end it once it started it. These arguments were tamed compared to the arguments of the non voting members like Richard Fisher and Esther George, who had replaced Tom Honig as the president of the Kansas City Fed. They argued that the plan would be ineffective, that exiting it would be difficult, and that the Fed was building up longer term risks that were difficult to measure, let alone mitigate. Bernanke's answers to these concerns was the same as it had been since the financial crisis. The Fed had to have the courage to act. Congress was clearly sitting on the sidelines. Growth was slow. The benefit of quantitative easing might be small, but if the Fed had the power to gain even small advantages, then it had an obligation to do so. We want to persuade our colleagues, and that's certainly laudable, he said. But the fact that nobody really knows precisely what is holding back the economy, what the correct responses are, or how our tools will work. Bernanke admitted that another round of quantitative easing was essentially a shot in the proverbial dark, but he believed that there were risks to not taking the shot, and just as important, they all needed to support his shot in the dark once it was made. I think it's really going to be important for all of us to pull together, in a sense, to support whatever efforts that we make, he said. The vote that day was a familiar one. In spite of their concerns, 11 of the FOMIC members voted for the plan. Only one voted against it. The single dissenting vote this time came from Jeffrey Lacker, the Richmond Fed president. Lacker's dissent really didn't matter. It could be explained away as the stubborn action of a cranky regional bank president. What did it what did matter was the fact that the Fed governors like Betsy Duke and Jay Powell supported the plan. Duke had been won over because option B was crafted in a way that gave the Fed flexibility. The option didn't set an end date or a specific amount of bond purchases, which gave the FOMIC the freedom to either intensify the program or reduce it, depending on the state of the economy. I genuinely believe that it was a temporary program and that our balance sheet would go back to normal, she recalled later. Almost immediately, she was proven wrong. When the Fed announced that its QE program would be open ended, Wall Street investors interpreted the ambiguity as a signal that the Fed was planning to go big. Within 3 months of launching the plan, the Fed's fundamental mistake was apparent. By January, the average dealer on Wall Street expected the Fed to keep purchasing assets through the end of 2013 by buying about 1 trillion in securities during the year. In reality, the Fed was only planning to purchase about 500 billion that year and planned to make the purchases only through June. This was particularly frustrating for Betsy Duke. She had voted for the program only because she believed that it would be limited. Now the market was expecting something far bigger. We've got comfortable with a $500 billion program, but nobody in the markets ever knew it was a $500 billion program. It immediately went to 1 trillion. 1.1 trillion, Duke later recalled after the Fed struck with its decided to stick with its original plan. It would be disappointing, a disappointment, and markets might fall. This imposed a choice on the FOMIC. The committee could either expand the program or tell the investors that they were mistaken. It's either going to be we end up with the program we never intended because we don't want to disappoint markets, or markets end up disappointed at the size of the program. One of those was going to happen, Duke said. She knew that some members of the FOMIC, such as Janet Yellen, would be fine with a 1 trillion third round of quantitative easing, but Duke was not. Neither, it became clear, was Jay Powell. During the FOMIC's January 2013 meeting, Powell abandoned his tone of moderation. Instead, he delivered a warning about the dangers and distortions of quantitative easing that was blunt and even horrifying in its way. Powell said that the Fed was potentially creating an asset bubble in the markets for debt like corporate bonds and leveraged loans, and the correction, when it came, could be deeply damaging. Many fixed income securities are now trading well above fundamental value, and the eventual correction could be large and dynamic, he said. The language was restrained, but the message was not. Powell was clearly saying that the Fed might be laying the foundation for another financial crisis or crash or a large and dynamic event, as he put it. This was around the time when Duke and Powell joined together to push back against Bernanke. They were joined by the former Harvard professor Jeremy Stein, who became a Fed governor along with Powell. Duke was particularly impressed with Powell's approach to the problem. After the FOMIC meetings, she would reread his comments and think about his critiques. The three governors began to meet and compare notes. They occasionally met for lunch in the Martin building, as an auxiliary Fed building just behind the Eccles building, which had a cafeteria and a private dining rooms. They united around a common goal: to force the Fed to stick with the program it had originally envisioned. This meant that they wanted to start winding down the asset purchases sometime around June. Bernanke knew about this mini insurrection as soon as he started describing Duke, Powell, and Stein as the Three Amigos. They posed a political problem for him. If they were to dissent in unison, it could bring an end to the program. During the March meeting, Powell presented the findings from his own personal survey of 75 investment managers. Many worked for exactly the kinds of institutions that were being pushed by the ZERP policies to make riskier and riskier investments: pension funds, insurance companies, and endowments. 64% of them said the Fed was incentivizing people to make investments that didn't make any sense. 74% were worried that the Fed would not be able to easily exit the quantitative easing program even if it wanted to. 84% said that the Fed was inflating the value of assets like corporate junk debt. They generally supported the Fed's efforts to have an accommodative policy, but they doubted the effectiveness of quantitative easing. Powell doubted it as well. "I think we need to regain control of this," he said during the meeting. The Fed was purchasing $85 billion in assets every month, In January 2013, Fed staff had estimated that the new round of QE would ultimately add 750 billion to the bank's balance sheets. But by March, even 750 billion was starting to look like a conservative estimate if the Fed didn't pull back or end the purchases. Bernanke met with Stein and Powell. He continued to negotiate with Duke. The three governors were unwavering. They wanted the FOMC to impose discipline on the program and cut back purchases. Stein gave public speeches about the inherent risks of quantitative easing. Both Powell and Duke continued to pressure Bernanke during FOMC meetings. Eventually, Bernanke reached a compromise with the three amigos. After the meeting in June, Bernanke would announce that the Fed might down its new start slowing down its new QE program. The goal was to clearly tell Wall Street traders that the QE program wasn't going to surpass 1 trillion, and it certainly wasn't going to last forever. Some traders seemed to believe. Duke and Powell agreed to this compromise. After the June meeting, Bernanke walked to the press room to deliver the news. Duke and the other governors often gathered in a conference room in the Eccles building to watch as his comments were carried live on CNBC. Bernanke was the first Fed chairman to give regularly scheduled press conference. He began the practice in April 2011 to help quell the political backlash that followed quantitative easing. After the blowback that greeted our introduction of QE in 2 in November, quarter 2 of November in 2010, we needed to do more than ever to explain our policies clearly and effectively, he wrote later in his memoir. The tactic was remarkably effective. Carola Binder, the economist who studied media coverage of the Fed, found that most outlets never covered FOMC meetings, unless Bernanke held a news conference. When that happened, the cameras put the focus on Bernanke himself, allowing him to shape the message. In the press room that June, Bernanke stood on a stage under bright lights that had been set up for the benefit of TV cameras. He went directly to a single chair behind a lectern where he sat down, opened a folder, and removed some papers that he placed on the lectern in front of him. Good afternoon, he began, looking up to address several rows of journalists who sat behind regular rectangular tables arranged in rows extending back to the rear of the room. The journalists were a well dressed crowd and with deadly serious glowers on their faces. Most had a laptop open in front of them on the table space. The stories they were already typing and the questions they had asked were instantly transmitted to eager crowds of financial traders staring at television sets across the world. Bernanke started with a prepared statement, and in the midst of it, he said, quantitative easing was essentially temporary. The Fed would likely taper off its purchases if growth remained strong and would consider ending the program around June 2014. Bernanke soft-pedaled the announcement as much as he could, emphasizing that the Fed would still keep interest rates at zero. Bernanke's first question came from Steve Leisman, a bulldog of a reporter from CNBC. Leisman wrote and zeroed in immediately on the idea that the Fed would be scaling back QE. I'd hate to use my question to ask you to clarify something, But when you said gradually reduce purchases beginning later this year and ending it next year, when the unemployment rate hits 7%, why and what is that? Is that a decision by the FOMIC? Bernanke equivocated. Obviously, there's no change. There's no change in policy involved here. There's simply a clarification, helping people to understand and to think about where policy will evolve. Bernanke's language remained vague and open ended, but even as he was talking, traders on Wall Street were executing orders based on what he was saying. They had heard one thing above all else: quantitative easing would be reduced, and it would probably be reduced sooner rather than later. What happened next was often described as kind of a market shock, or, or an unforeseen spasm of volatility. But it was, in fact, an entirely measured reaction to the idea that the Fed would slow down QE. This reaction became known as the taper tantrum. The taper tantrum was the first of multiple stock market shocks that would illustrate the profound fragility that ZERP and QE had embedded in the financial system. This It was helpful to understand this by thinking of the financial system as a seesaw. On one end of the seesaw, there are risky investments like stocks or corporate debt. On the other end of the seesaw, there are very safe investments like 10-year treasury bonds. Money travels back and forth from end to end on the seesaw depending on how bold investors feel. Since 2010, the Fed had been pushing money away, safe from the safe end of the seesaw to where the 10-year treasury bill sat. This was the whole point of QE, to force investors to push their money over to the risky end of the seesaw because the Fed was keeping interest rates low on a 10-year treasury bills by purchasing so many of them. When Bernanke indicated that the Fed would be buying fewer 10-year treasury bills, the money started to move back over to the safe end of the seesaw and away from the risky assets. This is when the seesaw tips, and it would do so with increasing velocity as the Fed's interventions became more extreme. The most obvious assumption and symptom of the taper tantrum was a sudden decline in stock market values. The Dow Jones Industrial Average fell by 1.35%, almost immediately on the chairman's remarks. But the stock market was actually a slideshow. The real danger showed up in the 10-year market for treasury bills, a bedrock of the global financial system. The interest rates on 10-year treasuries shot up the day of Bernanke's announcement by 0.126%. That might not sound like much, but in the world of ultra safe treasury bills, it was massive and jarring of a movement. The rate would jump over half a percent point from 2.2% the day before Bernanke's press conference to 2.73% within weeks. This movement didn't register as a financial crisis or even a market crash for most Americans, but it felt like the beginnings of a crisis inside Wall Street. Everybody could see what would happen if the money started rushing to the safe side of the seesaw and left the risky investments to survive with less cash. The balance of risk was changing quickly. Rising yields on Treasury meant that Wall Street might have a savings account again, and investors didn't need to keep their money out on the risky side of the yield curve. When this fact was apparent, investors turned around and looked at all the risky junk they'd bought, like leverage loans and corporate junk bonds. Interest rates fall on treasury bills when the Fed buys them because the Fed is increasing demand for those bills. When demand is high, a borrower has to pay less money in interest to get a loan, hence rate falls. They would and could now dump those investments and put their money somewhere safer. This is what started happening in late June and early July, and it happened in the kind of arcane markets where the Fed's QE monies flowed. Real estate investment trusts, REITs, began force selling their holdings as mortgage rates adjusted. Money fled from corporate bonds, and indebted companies saw their interest rates rise. Even within hours of the press conference, Betsy Duke was watching the taper tantrum play out on the television set in her office. She also had a Bloomberg computer terminal providing real time financial data. Her heart sank as she watched the Treasury rate spike. It reflected an almost instantaneous wiping out of all the work the Fed had just done. So many billions had been pumped into the banking system to push down Treasury rates, and now the declines were disappearing. At that point, it forced the Fed to be even more committed to continuing on, she said. The continuing on of the purchases there just kind of wasn't any choice at that point. They had to continue on, and they had to bring reassurance to the market that they were going to continue. The plan to taper was abandoned. The new round of quantitative easing had started as a small commitment in 2012. It was sold as an insurance policy and a contingency plan that could be withdrawn. In January 2013, an internal FOMIC memo described the QE plan as a program that would end in June 2013 and would add 750 billion dollars to the Fed's balance sheets, and said the program continued through September. Then it continued into December. It was only then that the Fed started to even diminish the size of its monthly purchases, and it did not end them. The quantitative easing program continued through June 2014, my bad, and then into October 2014. Finally, the Fed stopped making purchases that month. The $750 billion program ended as a $1.6 trillion program. The program's quick withdrawal, which had been forecast in the presentation by Seth Carpenter, never materialized. The Fed would not even attempt to start shrinking its holding until October 2017, and even then the effort was halting and largely unsuccessful. Ben Bernanke and the FOMIC had fundamentally redrawn the economic landscape and the rules of monetary policy. Betsy Duke announced in July 2013 that she was leaving the Fed board. Her resignation had nothing to do with the policy disagreements over quantitative easing. She had been on the job for 5 years, commuting between Washington, D.C. and her home in Virginia Beach. She was ready to move on to new things. At one of her final meetings in June, she said that she wanted to cast a dissenting vote. The quantitative easing policy had gone on for too long and had grown too large, but she voted along with the majority. The time to oppose it would have been at the beginning, she said. The Fed was locked into the asset purchases, and the program was creating new levels of debt across corporate America while also inflating asset prices. This wasn't an unintended consequence of QE, it was the goal. One of the Fed's own economists, David Refschneider, clearly explained during the FOMC meeting in 2012 that ZERP policies boosted growth through three channels: cost of capital, wealth effects, and the exchange rate. Translated, this meant that QE made debt cheaper, stoked asset prices, and devalued the dollar, which could boost more exports. At the same meeting, economist William English said QE would boost asset prices and adding more QE would boost them higher. In March 2013, the Fed economist Nellie Liang told the FOMC that low interest rates were already inflating asset prices, possibly stoking bubbles. This wasn't a forecast based on models, but an assessment based on the Fed's unparalleled market surveillance. But some of the most dire and most precedent warnings came from Jay Powell. While financial conditions are a net positive, there's also no reason to be concerned about the growing market distortions created by our continuing asset purchases, Powell said at the January FOMC meeting. He warned that the Fed was wrong to presume that it could clean up the mess after the bubble burst. In many cases, and we ought to have lowered the level of confidence that we can regulate or manage our own way around the kind of large dynamic market event that becomes increasingly likely thanks to our policy. Powell was concerned about one market in particular: the market for exotic, risky corporate debt. This was the kind of debt that private equity firms and hedge funds used to buy other companies. The debt, sometime in the form of leveraged loans, was packaged and resold, just as home loans had been during the 2000s. Back then, home loans were packed into something called a collateralized debt obligation, or CDO. In 2013, corporate debt was being resold as something called a collateralized loan obligation, or CLO. When Powell talked about leverage loans and buyouts, he was describing his own life experiences. He had spent a good part of his career engineering exactly the kinds of risky debt that he was now warning about. As this happened, Powell's experience in the private equity world would become directly intertwined with his experience at the Federal Reserve. So, there you have it. That was chapter 7. So, we are going to leave off there and pick up on chapter 8 in the next video. The next chapter is going to be The Fixer. So, as we're reading this and learning and growing together, it's becoming more and more apparent just how much power the Federal Reserve has, and they are all unelected beings that have power and control over our currency and money supply. And they even said it here in this chapter that they purposely devalue our currency, and when they devalue our currency, it means that it's getting harder, that basically your dollar is worth less than it was before they purposely devalued it. So we are going to continue in the next video. So if you liked the reading, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to learn and read and grow together. And I wish you all a good evening this Saturday, and have a good rest of your night. Thanks. Bye.